What's up? Welcome back to episode 4 of our Triple Dub podcast. It fills the stat sheet with record setting info about the latest NBA news, trends, and predictions. This is our first in season podcast, or I guess you could say in bubble podcast, and we are recording this on the night before this video is released in order to gain the best insight possible regarding the most recent games so we can be at least up to date when this airs. In fact, right now, we're watching as the fourth quarter of the Rockets versus Blazers game is going on, and it's a really tight one there. Let's see who will win. We'll probably know by the end of this. Now we're going to the initial takes.
Yep, I'm going to do the first initial take today, and I'm going to be talking about some of the scrimmages that occurred before the actual season restarted. So the NBA set up like across 6 days, I believe, to have all 22 bubble teams to play 3 scrimmage games. Um, During these scrimmage games, the best teams seem to be the Pelicans and the Thunder. I believe they were the only teams that actually won all 3 games. And it looked like the Pelicans were going to kind of carry that momentum into the regular season, but they seem to not be playing too well, especially compared to some of the teams that they're competing against for that 8th seed. And um, apart from that, something that was very interesting during the scrimmage games was the Nuggets going with a really weird uh, big ball lineup, I guess, kind of the opposite of the Rockets, where they were playing like Nikola Jokic at point guard, like Paul Millsap at shooting guard or something like that. And it was very strange. I think they won actually 2 games with that, and everyone thought it was going to be like super revolutionary, but really they only did it because they didn't have the depth. They're not actually doing it in the season, so it doesn't really matter that much. Um, Injuries were a slight concern during the scrimmages, but luckily there were no real major ones apart from Anthony Davis getting like slashed across the eye, but he ended up playing in game 1 anyway. However, during the actual season, both Jonathan Isaac and Jaren Jackson Jr. were injured and are out for the rest of the season, I believe. Additionally, Montrezl Harrell, the star sixth man center for the Clippers, unfortunately lost his grandmother just a few days ago, and he's been sitting out the past few games to grieve. So our thoughts go out to him and his family. Hopefully, he comes back soon and plays pretty well.
Thanks for the intro and initial take, Andy. As for my initial take, I will be talking about 3 underperforming teams. First of all, the Pelicans lost their first 2 games, which included a tough 2-point loss to the Jazz, and then another big 20-point blowout loss to the Clippers, which is pretty expected. This is probably because Zion has been getting some limited minutes. He played around 10 to 15 minutes within the first 2 games, but today he actually played a lot more minutes, around 20 plus. So because of that, the Pelicans were able to win. Coincidence? I think not. Furthermore, the Clippers have gone 1-2, and this is likely due to the loss of 2 points per game scorers coming off the bench, which were Montrezl Harrell and Lou Williams, as Andy mentioned before. Lastly, the Grizzlies have gone 0-3, and during 2 of these games, Ja played pretty badly, and in the other game that Ja actually played pretty well in, the rest of his teammates couldn't really keep up with him stat-wise and playing-wise. So because of that, the Grizzlies lost their games. And another important thing to note is that Jaren Jackson Jr. got injured, and he's a very big part of the Grizzlies' offense and defense and their starting lineup. And that's going to be a pretty big loss for the Grizzlies. And I think they'll still probably keep the 8th seed, but the play-in tournament's definitely going to be very difficult for them if it occurs.
I'm going to be talking about the opposite of what Rohan just talked about. These few teams who I'm going to talk about have been a surprising delight to watch in these first 2 or 3 games in the bubble, and they have surprised many teams and many analysts, including us, as to how well they have performed. The first team I'll talk about is the Indiana Pacers. Everyone was writing them off. They're going to fall to the 6th seed. They're going to get beaten in 4 or 5 games in the first round. There's no way they're going to be doing anything actually useful because they lost Sabonis. But no, TJ Warren has come and balled out of his mind. The winner of our most underrated player. You should have seen that video. That video was actually recorded before TJ Warren started balling out. So yeah, he's gotten the hype which he rightly deserves. He dropped 53 against the Sixers in a crucial win, and then he followed up with both 30-plus point performances on very good efficiency against the next two opponents they've placed, leading the Pacers to a 3-0 record, solidifying them as the fifth seed and winning the tiebreaker versus the Sixers. Another team which has performed extremely well is the San Antonio Spurs. They, although they're only 2-1, have done extremely well, being competitive with so many teams and only barely losing to the Sixers just recently. They have performed extremely well due to DeMar DeRozan taking it up another notch in the absence of LaMarcus Aldridge, and the stellar play from people like Derek White, Lonnie Walker, Jakob Poeltl, and DeJounte Murray. All obviously headed by Greg Popovich, who's one of the smartest coaches in our generation. Another team who's done extremely well is the Phoenix Suns, surprisingly. Everyone was writing them off. We actually had them at 20, and I had them at 21, but they are actually undefeated right now. They just beat the Los Angeles Clippers at full strength with Lou Williams, but without Montrez. But it just comes to show that Devin Booker and other pieces like DeAndre Ayton and Ricky Rubio can perform when they need to. Although I don't think they can carry this much further, it's been pretty fun to watch them. The last team I'll talk about is the Houston Rockets. Everybody was a little bit concerned about, are they really a contender? They've got so much talent, but they're playing small ball. 6'5" PJ Tucker at center doesn't work. But so far, it's been looking pretty good. Even though their defense isn't that great, in the clutch, it's been amazing. They beat two amazing team, high-power offenses in the Mavericks in overtime. They had an insane comeback in the last minute, and they even beat the Giannis-led Milwaukee Bucks. So I really like how this high-powered offense and Mike D'Antoni's system is working with both their superstars.
Thanks for that initial take, Aki. Those teams that you mentioned are definitely exceeding our expectations. Next, we will have our weekly trivia segment, and this time I am the host. I will ask Andy and Aki 5 questions related to the NBA worth 10 points each, and after 6 more episodes, the winners will make the loser do a forfeit. Just to remind everyone of the scores, Aki is on 70, Andy has 30, and finally, I have 40, but since I'm the host, I won't be participating. So now let's actually move on to the questions. First question is, what country was the person who invented the game of basketball from? A, Canada, B, Spain, C, US, and finally D, Argentina. Okay, the answers are in. We have an answer from Aki. Can you please say it?
James Naismith, I think, was from Canada, so A.
Yes, that is correct. He was from Canada. Andy actually got the correct answer, but was a little bit too late. So 10 more points for Aki. He is now on 80. Now on to the second question. This season, Giannis scored the most fantasy points, and Harden scored the second most fantasy points. Which player scored the third most fantasy points? A, LeBron James, B, Anthony Davis, C, Nikola Jokic, and finally D, Luka Doncic. We have an answer from Andy. Can you please say it?
I'm unconfident, but I'm going to guess Anthony Davis, B.
That's a pretty good guess. I believe he actually averaged more points per game than this person, but in total, he actually did not play all the games, so he had less total points. Now let's hear Aki's answer.
I wasn't sure either, and I know this guy missed a few games late in the season, but I'm gonna go with D. Luka.
That was a pretty good guess. This person also had Luka actually had more points per game than this person. The answer is actually C, Nikola Jokic. A little surprising, but he averaged like 27.4 points per game, and the guys that you chose had 30 points per game, but Nikola Jokic actually played more games, so that's why he had more total points. So now on to the third question. Which player that didn't make the bubble averaged the most points this season in fantasy? Another fantasy question. A, Trae Young, B, Andre Drummond, C, Julius Randle, and D, Kevin Love. We have an answer from Aki.
You said average, right?
Yes, I did. Average.
So I'm gonna go with Andre Drummond.
Unfortunately, that is incorrect. He was the second most in the average. So let's move on to Andy's answer.
I have no clue, but I have to stay loyal to my Knicks, I guess. So I'll go see Julius Randle.
Yeah, that was pretty close. But no, it is not the correct answer. The answer is actually Trae Young. He had a lot of points per game, but yeah, that's the correct answer. So now let's move on to the fourth question. What jersey number does RJ Barrett wear? This one should be pretty easy for Andy. I feel like Aki should be able to get this though, just because he watches a lot more basketball than both of us. So the options are A7, B8, C4, and D9. An answer from Andy.
If I get this wrong, I'm a terrible Knicks fan, but I think it's D9. Could
I'm
be
just
right.
kidding. No, you got that question correct.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, did your Knicks proud. Aki got the correct answer as well, a little bit too late, but still got the correct answer. At least I guess that counts for something. Okay, now question 5. What team drafted Eric Bledsoe in the 2010 draft? A. Thunder, B. Suns, C. Nets, and D. Spurs. This one was pretty tricky. An answer from Aki.
I was wondering whether he had a trade or not, but you said tricky. But you said tricky after I had already submitted my
Yeah,
response.
I didn't want to give any hints.
Yeah, so I put the team which he played for most recent, or like early in his career, which was the Suns.
Unfortunately, that's incorrect. I actually just put the Suns in there to try to trick you guys because I knew that he played for the Suns. Let's see Andy's answer.
I put B.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was the same answer as Aki, the Suns, and that is incorrect. The answer is actually the Thunder, A. I know, this is surprising, but it is the answer. So that just wraps it up for trivia. Let's move on to our main segment now.
Thanks for the trivia, Rohan. That was a bit difficult. I think in total we only got together 2 of the 5 questions correct. But for the main segment of this episode, we'll be discussing some updates, news, and takes about the games this week and how they impact the season going forward. First, we have Rohan.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Aki. So today I'm going to be talking about the fantasy from our previous triple dub video. You should watch that out. That's where we drafted our whole team. We also added some new bench players. We each drafted 3 bench players off camera, and you can see that in the spreadsheet linked in the description below or in the description of the previous triple dub video. But anyways, as for the standings, so far I have 573 points, Aki has 685 points, Kez has 567 points, and Andy has 671 points. But obviously these points don't necessarily reflect our actual players' performances, since some players have played more games than others. But just looking at the amount of games, and from the top of my head, definitely looks like Andy's doing the best, just based on how his players still have many games to play, but he has so many points. So yeah. Some more things to note are that Bradley Beal, Domantas Sabonis both got injured from my team. They're pretty big hits. So to compensate for that, I got 10 points per game for each of my games, just to make up for that, since the players that replaced them, on average, it was like a 10 points per game reduction, so it made sense. Furthermore, Dennis Schroeder was one of the bench players that Aki got, but he had to leave the bubble for the birth of his son, so Aki was able to get Evan Fournier instead. Another thing to note is that Kez was able to get Kyle Kuzma actually today because Jaren Jackson Jr. got injured. Now that's going to be interesting to see how Kyle Kuzma plays without AD and LeBron. Furthermore, Spencer Dinwiddie got injured and Andy got Tobias Harris. So anyways, this fantasy is going to continue and we'll keep updating you with how each of us is doing. But if you want to see how we're doing live outside the video, you can find that in the spreadsheet link below. So that just wraps it up for the fantasy update for this week.
Thanks for the fantasy update, Rohan. Even though I'm in the lead right now, I don't think that lead is safe at all. Now, I have the updated power rankings of the 22 teams in the bubble. You might have seen each of our initial takes for the power rankings in the 22 videos we had in the 22 and 22 series. That allowed us to gain a lot more viewership, and it exposed us a lot more to video making and video editing. So I think that was a fun process overall. But now every week we're going to be having an update for the overall power rankings based on the performance of teams in the recent week. So I'll go through them pretty quickly from the bottom to the top. At 22, we still have the Wizards. 21, even though they went 2-1, we have the Nets. At 20, we have the Kings. At 19, we have the Suns. And at 18, we have the Grizzlies. Let's talk about this first 5. So a lot of these teams haven't performed too well, but some of them have, right? So an obvious surprise to have here is the Grizzlies. They are currently the 8th seed, but they have fallen all the way to 18, in my opinion, because their poor 0-3 start and the loss of Jaren Jackson Jr. I personally think that there is a strong chance that they fall out of the 8th seed. Yes, even though they are the 8th seed right now, they could fall out of the 8th seed. And then if they even keep the 9th seed or keep the 8th seed, I do not think that they would win, especially in their current play.
Yeah, I actually redid the power rankings myself too a bit, and I actually had the Grizzlies even lower. I believe I had them at 20th, because not only have they taken 3 L's during the restart, all 3 of these L's are against teams that they could be playing against in a play-in tournament, and they clearly are worse than, I believe, all 3 of them, because they lost all 3 of them. So I think that if they were to go to a play-in tournament as either the 8th or the 9th seed, they wouldn't win against any of the 3 teams they faced, or really, or maybe even other teams that they didn't face. So that's why I think that they really have no chance. Well, they have a very slim chance of making the playoffs, in my opinion. And then if they do, they're not really getting anywhere further than the first round.
Yeah, I'm with Andy here. I think the Grizzlies should definitely be a little bit lower. Although they do have a pretty good record as of now, I think that's definitely going to decline. And going into the play-in tournament, which was very likely to occur, I think that the Grizzlies will most likely actually lose to their 9th seed contender, just because they lost Jaren Jackson Jr. and their performance has been pretty bad, even with Jaren Jackson Jr. on their lineup. So I think that's definitely going to be a bad thing for the Grizzlies. Another thing to note is that a team like the Suns, who are a 9th seed contender, have actually been doing very well. They won all 3 of their games, and unlike the Grizzlies, who lost against pretty bad 9th seed contenders, the Suns beat very good teams such as the Mavericks and the Clippers earlier today, actually, where Devin Booker hit a game winner. That was a very good game. So I think that the Grizzlies, compared to some of their 9th seed counterparts, like the Blazers, just like the Blazers and the Spurs, the Suns, I think that they are looking a lot worse right now, even if their record may be better.
All right, now we talked about the bottom 5. Let's go to the next 4, all of which are, I guess, bottom seed playoff contenders. At 17, we have the Orlando Magic. At 16, we have the New Orleans Pelicans. At 15, we have the San Antonio Spurs. And at 14, we have the Portland Trailblazers. So the San Antonio Spurs have jumped all the way from number 21 in our collective power rankings to number 15, in my opinion, due to their really strong start, winning 2 clutch games due to the amazing play of DeMar DeRozan, and they only barely lost to the 76ers recently. So they have done extremely well considering their situation, and are currently finding themselves at the 10th seed, only a half a game behind the Blazers, who actually, as we're recording this, they have just beaten the Rockets. So I guess they definitely deserve their number 14 spot right now. So now the Spurs are actually a full game behind the Grizzlies or Blazers.
Yeah, another thing that's interesting is that the Pelicans. Where did you have them again? I forgot. Sorry.
At 16.
Yeah, 16. I think I had them a little bit lower in my personal rankings. I have them at 17 actually. But when you look at their like last few games, they took two pretty big L's. Well, I guess not huge L's. The first one was a pretty close game against the Utah Jazz. But I think a lot of people expected them to kind of come out in the bubble, just like being the clear best team of kind of those like ninth seed competitors, like with like the Blazers and the Spurs and the Suns, especially considering how well they were performing during the scrimmages, which we already talked about. But they really have looked very, very weak compared to their competition. So that's why I think they should be lower than the Spurs and the Trailblazers and maybe even the Suns at a stretch. But like that'd be a bit of a stretch. I'm not sure because the Suns are still the 12th seed, I believe. But the Pelicans definitely need to start performing better and need to be utilizing Zion, especially if they want to have a chance to get into the ninth seed play-in tournament.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you guys, but I think that the Pelicans, they're a little bit underrated right now, actually. Because if you look at the schedules of some of the other 9th seed contenders, like the Blazers or the Spurs, you'll see that they're facing mostly teams with winning records, which are very difficult to play against. But if you look at the Pelicans, because they had a very difficult regular season before it ended, they are getting some easier games now. So specifically, some of the teams that they're facing are the Kings and the Wizards and the Magic, and especially with the Magic losing Jonathan Isaac as well, I think that these games will definitely be easier for the Pelicans. I'm pretty sure that the reason why Zion didn't play full minutes was because he left the bubble, but now that he's back and he's now integrated into all of the new Pelicans practices, and now that he's actually played 2 games, I think that his minutes are going to start going up. And seeing that Zion is going to start playing more, and that the Pelicans have easier games, I think that they probably deserve a higher ranking.
All right, let's talk about the next 5 teams. At 13, I have the Utah Jazz. At number 12, I have the Dallas Mavericks. At number 11, I have the Philadelphia 76ers. At number 10, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder. And at number 9, we have the Indiana Pacers. So I'm going to talk about the most recent team I just said, the Indiana Pacers. They have outperformed all expectations and have started off really strong, especially considering their schedule going forward. I think that they can win at least a solid 5 out of the 8, if not 6 out of the 8 games, which position themselves really well for keeping the number 5 seed, which is really good moving forward. In the next year when Sabonis comes back, this team with TJ Warren's newfound dominance alongside players like Malcolm Brogdon, Victor Oladipo, Miles Turner, and the Holiday brothers, it's just going to be a really good team going forward.
All right, so Aki talked about a team that is doing a lot better than people expected, which caused them to move up 4 spots, I believe. I'm going to talk about the exact opposite, which is a team that actually went down 5 spots, I believe, because of their terrible performance. Not terrible, but pretty bad, which is the 76ers. So first of all, they lost to the Pacers. So I think based on that alone, you kind of have to put the Pacers above the Sixers, which is what we did. And they barely beat the Spurs, who were someone we actually put at like 21 in our 22 series. So the Sixers have definitely not been performing as well as they should. Joel Embiid has been good, I guess, but Ben Simmons has been underperforming. And Tobias Harris has been like okay, I guess. But the 76ers are definitely not doing as well as we expected them to do, because we did believe that there was going to be a kind of increase in how they played because of the because there's no real like away games in this format, but it actually seems to be hurting them a bit. Maybe the lack of home fans is what's hurting them. But the Sixers definitely are not looking like a very good playoff contender right now, and I could definitely see them losing in the first round at this point.
Now, one player that I want to mention is TJ Warren. I believe you guys already talked about him, but I want to go a little bit more into depth on what he's done. So don't get me wrong, I think that TJ Warren is a great player. He's put up some great stats these past few games, shot very well, played some pretty good defense too. But I think that the teams that he faced were conducive to his very good performance. I think the Sixers, just looking at them stat-wise, they may have players that play good defense, but when they work together, I don't know if they necessarily play the best, because the Sixers had pretty bad defense on TJ Warren. He was able to drop over 50 points on them. He had very good shooting, very efficient. Um, and then if you look at his next game, he's facing the Wizards. I really don't need to do much explaining with the Wizards. They're the Wizards. And then the next team they faced, I believe, was the Magic actually. And the Magic generally have pretty good defense. They're known for being a good defensive team. But the thing is, Jonathan Isaac got injured, and he was probably the guy to guard TJ Warren. Maybe Aaron Gordon, but Aaron Gordon's defense is all right. Jonathan Isaac is probably the main guy, probably their best defender. And with him out, I think the Magic had to totally adapt to a new situation without him, and that definitely contributed to the loss. I believe like their defense and their offense were a little bit uncoordinated that game, and that gave TJ Warren the opportunity to play very well. So I think TJ Warren's really good. I think he's going to continue to play really well, but I think he'll probably average like 25 to 30 points, maybe like 5 to 6 assists and rebounds per game. I don't think he'll be able to put up these insanely good stats like he's been doing for these past 3 games.
Well, that might be true, but we move on to our next 4 teams. At number 8, I have the Denver Nuggets. At number 7, I have the Boston Celtics. At number 6, I have the Miami Heat. And at number 5, I have the Houston Rockets. Now, this was made right before we got the news that the Rockets lost to the Blazers, so I guess I might swap the Rockets and Heat. But based off of what I have, I'm going to talk about like the Celtics sort of fall a bit. Like yes, the Celtics are a really amazing team, but they haven't really shown how good they can be. And their offensive firepower has been very much mitigated. Yes, originally in their first game, they lost to the Bucks, which is kind of expected. But it was a relatively close game. The players were playing well, but Jason Tatum had an absolutely abysmal game. This is a game I think he shot 2 for 18 from the field, and then Kemba was on a minutes restriction, but he still played extremely well. But their defense didn't really show. Their next game was against the Trailblazers. Everybody expects like the Celtics with all their firepower to beat the Blazers, and that was how it looked going into halftime. I mean, at halftime, I think it was a 19 or 20 point lead, and it ballooned to I think 22 or 24 points. But then suddenly, in the span of like 8 minutes, the Blazers took a 5-point lead, and that just shows that okay, this team may not be as like I guess you could say a stable, really good team as you might think they are, because they could just blow leads like that super easily. But ultimately, they did come and win the game. And then most recently, they lost to the Miami Heat, which is the team which we had previously ranked a bit lower than them. And they just lost to them, even though all of their starters were playing a lot of minutes. And in fact, Jimmy Butler was not playing in this game. So that comes to show that, okay, maybe we're not 100% sure about how good the Celtics are.
Yeah, I think I pretty much agreed with all of your rankings there, pretty much. But the one thing I want to point out for the Celtics is that I think there is, although they haven't been playing super well, as like especially Jason Tatum in his first game, I just like to point out that he actually played so badly in that game. He got me negative fantasy points. Like that's just pretty sad. But anyway, I think they have showed Jason Tatum has definitely improved over the past few games. I believe Kemba Walker was playing limited minutes, I believe. I think that the Celtics still have hope, and I think that they've showed signs that they can still be the team that they were supposed to, especially during that Trailblazers game before they started like choking during the second half. But I think that even though they kind of haven't been playing so well, they still are a pretty good playoff contender that I think can make it to the second round. Or probably the second round.
Yeah, so I have pretty similar opinions with you guys. I do think that the Celtics have the very good talent and the potential to be very good, but they are a little bit inconsistent at times. But a team that I do want to talk about is the Houston Rockets. And some things that they have done so far have been very impressive. First of all, they were very behind the Mavericks. They were around like maybe a 10-point deficit in the fourth quarter with like 5 minutes left. I believe they actually originally had a lead, but then the Mavericks took an even bigger lead. But the fact that the Rockets were able to tie the game with some very clutch free throws and that they were able to go into overtime and totally overpower the Mavericks, that's very impressive, and it definitely counts for something. And I think that the experience of James Harden and Russell Westbrook and some veterans on the Rockets team, including Austin Rivers, who's kind of a veteran, and Daniel House as well, and Covington, I think that the experience, and Jeff Green as well, just the experience of those veterans has definitely been a very good presence for the Rockets. And I think that for the Mavericks also, they're not very clutch because their team is pretty young, and I don't know if they're necessarily the best in high pressure situations. But the fact that the Rockets are very good in high pressure situations, as shown by this game, is definitely a big benefit. And another thing to add on to this is that they beat the Bucks. They're actually down in the fourth quarter. They're actually down going into the fourth quarter by a point, but they were able to secure the win. It was a very, very close game, and that's another game that goes to show that the Rockets are very clutch, perhaps even more clutch than the Giannis Antetokounmpo-led Bucks. The Rockets did lose to the Blazers. That was a little bit concerning. That I guess that game's a little bit of an outlier. I think in general the Rockets would, like 9 out of 10 times, the Rockets wouldn't lose this game. I think the Blazers have just been performing pretty exceptionally well compared to what people thought they would be performing. But anyways, I think that the Rockets will perform very well for the next few games. I think that the Blazers game was just a little bit of an outlier.
All right, now we're going to be talking about the top 2 seeds in each conference. These are the top 4 teams, which we had in our 22 and 22 series, and they still remain the top 4 seeds. But the order has changed. At number 4, falling from number 2, it hurts me because I had this team at number 1, is the Los Angeles Clippers. At number 3, we have the Toronto Raptors. At number 2, we have the Milwaukee Bucks. And staying strong at number 1, we have the Los Angeles Lakers. So I'm going to talk about the LA Clippers. The LA Clippers, coming into this, I thought were clearly the best team. They have the pieces. They don't have any attitudes on the team. Kawhi Leonard, it doesn't even talk to the media. He doesn't have any social media. He's just focused on the game. Paul George has kind of been the second option to Kawhi Leonard this entire time. And yes, they didn't have Lou Will or Montrez for this time, but they still had so many good pieces. They had Patrick Beverley. They had Marcus Morris. They had Ivica Zubac. They had JaMychal Green. They had so many pieces who were just could easily lead them to wins over certain teams. I definitely thought that coming into the first game versus the Lakers, I thought the Clippers should have had that in the bag. They were leading for quite a bit in the game, but they fell behind in the fourth quarter. Paul George had an extremely clutch 3, but LeBron ultimately got the game winner in that game, so they lost. Then they beat the Pelicans without Zion for most of it pretty easily. That was sort of expected. But then today, they lost to the Phoenix Suns. The Phoenix Suns. I mean, these are the Clippers playing at full strength, and they have lost to the Phoenix Suns. Yes. So Devin Booker just beat Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and every single person who I mentioned, including Lou Williams, who was back for this game, following his 10-day quarantine because he decided to get some, let's just say, chicken wings at a very interesting place. Overall, Kawhi and Paul George haven't been too amazing. If you look at the fantasy points, actually, they're only averaging around 25 fantasy points a game.
All right, yeah. So I think if Lou Williams is able to kind of return to his true best form and Montrezl Harrell returns, the Clippers do kind of have a chance to climb back up the rankings, I guess, back to 3 or maybe even 2. But another thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the Raptors and the Bucks. Now I know I've been talking about kind of how the Raptors should be above the Bucks even before like the season restarted, and maybe it would be expected that I say the same again now. But these are collective rankings, and I think that even though the Bucks did lose a few games, that's not really indicative of how good they are as a team, considering they sat out Giannis for I think more than half of the games, or like more than half of the time during the games, I guess. And even though the Raptors did get a win against the Lakers, I'm not really sure if you can attribute that completely to the Raptors being an amazing team. The Lakers did look very lackluster, more so than they normally do, especially with AD only making like 2 buckets the whole game, which is pretty surprising. So I think there's a case for the Raptors to go above the Bucks, and I certainly would put them there. But I'm not like surprised that the collective rankings aren't as I want them to be, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what both of you had said so far. But another thing that I wanted to add was that the Lakers and the Bucks have already secured the number 1 seeds in their respective conferences, and because of that, they can be resting their stars and their starters. And specifically, the Lakers will probably be resting Anthony Davis and LeBron James. So you can see some other players on the Lakers expecting to get more minutes. But I think this goes to show that the Lakers are probably going to start tanking and losing some more games, because I don't really think there are any records they can be chasing. So they really have no reason to be playing their starters. So they're going to definitely be losing some games, but it doesn't really matter. But it doesn't really matter for them. But going into actual playoffs, I think I definitely agree with your ranking. And as for the Bucks, same thing here. They're probably going to be resting Chris Middleton and Giannis, maybe Eric Bledsoe and some other starters as well. But as for the Raptors and the Clippers, I definitely agree with the decision to have the Raptors over the Clippers. I think that the sudden return of Lou Williams after his absence in the first 2 games and the scrimmage games, as well as the loss of Montrezl Harrell, I think that's definitely having an impact. And Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, they've been playing pretty well. Like they've been putting up the points that they've been and like the stats that they've been averaging, but they haven't really been like outstanding, like T.J. Warren or Joel Embiid, for example, or James Harden, as a matter of fact, who've had very big standout performances. I think when you have 2 big stars like Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, I think that it's pretty concerning if they don't really have big performances. And like especially against teams like the Suns, who aren't really that good defensively, and who also don't have Kelly Oubre Jr. So I think that the Clippers rightfully have the 4th spot and not the 3rd spot. And the Raptors have definitely been playing some great basketball, and they've basically secured the number 2 seed.
All right, that wraps it up for this week's segment of the Power Rankings. Now, Andy, with our last part of our main segment.
All right, yeah, that was definitely a good discussion about kind of how teams have been performing overall during the restart. But now we want to talk about more how specific individual players have been doing. So that's why our last segment for these kind of in-season podcasts is a team of the week, where we assemble the best 5 players during the last few days to basically to make a team of the week. So we didn't want to make it too restrictive, having to do a point guard, a shooting guard, a small forward, a power forward, and center. We also didn't want it to have to be like super unrestrictive with just like pick the top 5 players. We've gone for kind of the in-between format, which is 2 guards, 2 forwards, and a center. So let's start with the guards. When I'm looking at who's been the best who's had the best performance, I don't know, I can't speak. I'm looking not only at how well they have played personally, but also whether their performance has been able to contribute to wins for their team. So kind of the 4 players I was looking at were both of the star Rockets guards, because the Rockets have been playing very well, which are James Harden and Russell Westbrook. I also picked the Mavericks point guard Luka Doncic, and finally someone from kind of the lower end of the standings, I guess, in Devin Booker. Now, I think the obvious one that I had to really include is James Harden, because not only has he had the best stats, putting up a ridiculous stat line against the Bucks of 49, 8, 7, 3, and 3, and also playing very well against the that stat line was against the Mavericks, sorry, but he also played very well against the Bucks, and he got 2 wins. Did lose to the Trailblazers, but we're not going to talk about that. He has been playing very well, and his team has been winning a lot, so that's why he's a lock. I think the player that we can't really include, however, is Russell Westbrook, because he has definitely been outshined by James Harden, I believe. I think that he definitely wasn't kind of a standout player, even though he did put up some good stats. I think that it would kind of be too crazy, I guess, to put 2 Rockets players at both guard positions. So it's between Luka Doncic and Devin Booker. There's kind of arguments for both of them. Doncic is definitely the better player stat-wise, averaging 34, 14, and 11 over the past few games. And he even became he set a record becoming the youngest player to put up 30 points, 20 rebounds, and 10 assists in a game. But the Mavericks are 1-2. On the other hand, Devin Booker is 3-0, and he still has pretty good stats, averaging 31 points a game with 4 rebounds and 5 assists. So I actually picked Devin Booker above Luka Doncic, even though he doesn't have the same stats. He's been able to contribute to wins, and he's really been carrying the Suns, who are a team that was supposed to be terrible, as we already mentioned, to 3 very surprising wins, including one against the Clippers, where he hit a game winner. So I definitely think that Devin Booker deserves to have this spot.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your decision here. In my personal ranking, I actually had Devin Booker and James Harden both on the list, and for the same exact reasons. With James Harden, first of all, he had very good offensive performances, but he also had very good defense, which is very surprising and a little bit uncharacteristic of him. But he had very good defense in his game against the Mavericks, even though his whole team let a lot of points be scored. His individual defense was actually pretty solid. He had around 3 steals, I believe, and he had a lot of blocks too, 3, I believe also. And that was very impressive. Against the Bucks, his defense was also pretty good. I personally haven't looked into the specific stats of the Blazers game, as it ended about maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago, but I'm sure it was all right. And anyways, for Devin Booker, I think even though his stats may not necessarily be as good as Luka's stats, just looking at the way he plays in the games, he definitely has a bigger impact on his team. I feel like he's kind of been the main guy that's been carrying the Suns. Like, the Mavericks have many good players on very good supporting cast with Kristaps Porzingis and Steph Curry and some other pretty good players. But with the Suns, I guess the number 2 guy is DeAndre Ayton, but he's had some foul trouble. He's been having some limited minutes. But Devin Booker, he put the whole team on his back. He's scoring all these points. And actually, earlier today against the Clippers, he hit this really good game winner. Paul George played really good defense on him, and he hit this really good fadeaway. Totally switched the ball as well. Very good way to end the game, and just sort of the icing on the cake, and as to show how good Devin Booker has been doing and how much of an impact he's been having outside of the stats as well.
Yeah, I really don't have much to say. I thought it was pretty obvious that these 2 should be in there. I think some other guys that you could mention who have had some good games this week include players like Chris Paul or De'Aaron Fox.
All right, so now we're moving on to the forwards now, and I also kind of considered 4 players for this one as well, and those were DeMar DeRozan, TJ Warren, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and finally Anthony Davis. Now, there's one that has to go in, and it's just like a fact, because he has been 100% the best player this week. It is the Pacers forward TJ Warren. He kind of carried the Pacers, I guess, to 3-0, including a win against the Sixers, who were supposed to be a really good team, but maybe aren't. He's averaged a ridiculous 40 points a game, as well as some decent 6 rebounds and 3 assists. That included actually a 53-point game, which was insane in the first game of the restart. So I think there's no debate that he deserves to be in this team. A player that I couldn't have was Anthony Davis, because he was decent, sure, but he did have a kind of lackluster second game where he only shot like the ball twice, I think, or he only made the ball twice in like 7 shots, I believe. And I think that in order to make the team of the week, you kind of have to be a very good performer every game of the week. So I couldn't have Anthony Davis. But the other 2 options were Giannis Antetokounmpo and DeMar DeRozan. Now, Giannis Antetokounmpo averaged very strong stats of 29, 13, and 6, even with some limited minutes, especially in the most recent game. However, the Bucks are 1-2. This is kind of a similar situation to Luka Doncic, I guess. On the other hand, DeMar DeRozan, kind of like Devin Booker, has gone 3-0. That's not correct. I think he's gone 2-1, but he only barely lost a game to the 76ers. And he's averaged 24, 5, and 7, which is still really good. And once again, like the guard spot, I'm going to be making the same decision. I'm going to go with the player who has put the team on his back and carried them to 2 wins, even though he doesn't have as good of stats. But just DeMar DeRozan has been super impressive. He's definitely surprised me, especially considering the Spurs didn't even have, I can't even think, LaMarcus Aldridge. He, under the guidance of Popovich, has put up some incredible performances for the Spurs and has made them a real playoff contender. So that's why he goes in my team of the week.
Yeah, I agree with your team of the week for the forward position for the most part, but 2 things I wanted to mention were that I think Kristaps Porzingis definitely deserves an honorable mention. Although he may have been outshined by Luka a little bit, I think that even then his performances have been very good. In the first game, Luka didn't necessarily shoot as well as he normally did, shot around like 30 to 40%, but Kristaps Porzingis played very, very well. He got 39 points in 39 minutes, shooting 13 for 26, and he got 16 rebounds. He also had 2 steals and 1 block, and this was the game against the Rockets. So although they did lose the game, it was a very, very close game, and it definitely wasn't Kristaps Porzingis' fault, as he had a very, very solid game. And just looking at some of his 2 other games against the Suns and the Kings, although they may not be the best of teams, just looking at the amount of points he had and the efficiency and the shooting percentage, excluding the Kings game, I think his performance was very good against the Suns. He also had very good defense. He had 4 blocks. He's recorded at least 1 steal in all of those games. So I definitely think he deserves an honorable mention. I do agree that he doesn't deserve to be on the list, but just an honorable mention for a good performance. Another thing that I wanted to add was that I totally agree with the decision to have DeMar DeRozan. Although he may not necessarily have the best stats on paper, if you watch the games, similar to the situation with Devin Booker, you'll see that he has a huge impact on the team. Because when DeMar DeRozan plays well, the whole team plays well. And he sort of put the whole team on his back in the game against the Kings. I believe that the Spurs were actually down a couple of points in the late 4th quarter, and everyone expected even like this percentage win tracker on NBA.com. It said that the Kings had an 80% chance to win or something like that. But DeMar DeRozan proved that wrong. He was able to score a lot of points, get the Spurs back in the game, and they actually ended up winning. So I think DeMar DeRozan definitely deserves a spot on the team.
Yeah, I am probably the only person in the opinion that DeMar DeRozan doesn't deserve a spot. He's been extremely good these past 3 games, especially his first game and his most recent game against the 76ers. I definitely think he had some insane clutch baskets, but if you looked at Giannis's stats, it's just insane. The first 2 games, both DeRozan and Giannis had a down game, but Giannis was because he just played less minutes. DeRozan played a full 34 minutes, but still only scored 14. Giannis played 16 minutes and scored 16. But the other 2 games, he had 36 and 36, 15, and 7 in the first game on 70% shooting. And then the next game against the Rockets, even though they lost, he had 36, 18, and 8, which is just insane. Like, I mean, yes, he lost the game, but Giannis still performed extremely well. And he only played 32, 33 minutes in each game.
We're moving on to the final position now, which is the centers. The candidates are both Nicolas, the Joker, and Nikola Vucevic. We also have the recent addition, well, not addition, but recovering from injury player, I guess, in Jusuf Nurkic. And finally, we have Joel Embiid. So let's talk about Jusuf Nurkic first. He has been very good. He's actually averaged 21, 10, and 4. That's actually in the first 2 games. I actually didn't get the chance to incorporate his stats from the most recent win. But I think he actually played pretty well. He got like 15 assists or something. But he's been good, but I just don't think that he's been enough. I think the only reason people have been really saying that he's been so amazing is because he's been gone. You know, kind of he's back and he's made this big impact on the Blazers, but I just don't think that he's done quite enough to deserve this spot. And then you also look at Nikola Vucevic, who's averaged slightly better stats with 21, 11, and 8. But the Magic also are only 1-1, which isn't particularly amazing. Additionally, he, I don't know, I guess the stats just aren't as good as some of the other players on this list, so I can't really have him in my team of the week. So it comes down to Nikola Jokic then and Joel Embiid. And we have a similar situation as some of the earlier ones, where we have one player who is better stat-wise and one player who won more. First of all, Nikola Jokic has won 2 games for the Nuggets, and he's averaged 23 points, 9 rebounds, and 3 assists. That's it basically. And then Joel Embiid is only 1-1, I believe, and he's averaged 34 points, 15 rebounds, and 4 assists. In the previous two positions, I guess, I kind of chose the player that had the more wins. But in this situation, I'm actually not doing that. I'm going to go for Joel Embiid here. And because the wins difference isn't really that huge, you know, the other ones it was like 3-0 versus like 1-2. This one is just like 2-1 versus 1-1. It's a very minimal difference, I guess. And additionally, Joel Embiid is just so good statistically. He's been compared to Nikola Jokic. 34 points is just insane, as well as 15 rebounds. And I think that Joel Embiid has kind of been a shining light, I guess, a glimmer of hope in the midst of darkness for the 76ers, as they've been pretty bad, which is mainly like Ben Simmons' fault, I guess. But Joel Embiid has definitely been pretty good, and it's not really his fault that his teammates have been trash. So I'm putting Joel Embiid in the team.
Yeah, I actually agree with you here. I think in the previous positions, we actually had the player that played better for their team higher than the player that played better individually. And actually in this case, I do agree that Joel Embiid should go over Nikola Jokic. Because although Nikola Jokic did have a triple-double, if you look at his other game, you'll see that he actually performed all right, not as good as he normally would have. He had 19 points, shooting 7 for 16, 1 for 5 from the 3, 7 rebounds, and 6 assists in a loss against the Heat. And it was actually a pretty significant loss as well. So I think that one game, if Nikola Jokic had another triple-double and the Nuggets won, then I think that he would have deserved the spot. But the fact that his game against the Heat wasn't really that good, I think that's why Joel Embiid should get the spot. Because if you look at Joel Embiid's games, like although he was 1-1 as well, if you look at the game that he lost, he still performed very, very well. He was very efficient, extremely good stats, and I do agree it wasn't his fault that his teammates weren't playing that well. And for that reason, I have Joel Embiid on the list over Nikola Jokic, but both players are really good.
For me, it's a lot closer, and I think I may actually have Nikola Jokic a bit higher because the thing is, you're saying, oh, it's not his fault that his teammates didn't play well. Well, it's not Nikola Jokic's fault that he didn't have his best teammate. Jamal Murray hasn't played in either of the two games that have occurred so far for the Denver Nuggets. So the offensive focus has solely been in guarding Nikola Jokic. Um, Although we have seen other players like Michael Porter Jr. in one recent game perform extremely well, it still doesn't make up for the fact that Jamal Murray hasn't played a single game. So yes, although they did lose to the Heat by 20, one, it's the Heat, who have Bam Adebayo at center and Jimmy Butler at forward, who are both amazing defenders, who could defend Jokic, and Jokic is the only person to defend.
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify one thing. I actually made a slight mistake. I got Jokic and Vucevic's stats swapped, so it's not really a big deal. The team of the week is still the same in my opinion, but yeah, I just like to point that out. Anyway, that kind of wraps it up. So just to clarify, just to recap, I guess, team of the week, we got Devin Booker as well as James Harden at the guard positions. At forwards, we have DeRozan and TJ Warren, and at center we have Joel Embiid. Let us know if you agree with that team of the week.
Finally, we have a hot take segment where we'll each make a controversial prediction about the performance of one team or a player in the bubble. I'm going to start with my hot take, which is about TJ Warren. I already elaborated about him a little bit in a previous segment, but all I wanted to say was that I think TJ Warren has had some really, really good and phenomenal games. He put up 50 points in one of his other games. He had amazing defensive stats as well, and very efficient shooting too. But I think that his stats are actually very inflated, and they're not really reflective of his true skill. So I understand that he may just be on a hot streak right now, but I think that the teams that he's faced are very conducive to the reason why he's been playing so well. Specifically, if you look at the Sixers, like they have some good individual defenders like Matisse Thybulle and Ben Simmons, but when they work together in a defensive zone or a man-to-man, they don't really work that well together. So having good individual defenders is definitely a necessity, but also having defenders that work together well is another necessity. So that's why I think that TJ Warren was able to have a very good game because the Sixers defense was just out of sync. Because the Pacers also had around 50 points in the fourth quarter. Most of the points are actually by TJ Warren. So that's very alarming as well. The next game that the Pacers had was against the Wizards. And, the Wizards are the Wizards. They're not really good at anything. So, yeah. And then as for the Magic are known for having a good defense, but they lost Jonathan Isaac. And Jonathan Isaac was probably the guy to be on TJ Warren, maybe Aaron Gordon, but I think Jonathan Isaac is the better defender, so he would probably be on the Pacers' number one option. And as we know, he did get injured, and with him injured, I think that also sort of alarmed the Magic's defense, and they're just out of sync, I believe. 120 points is not usually an amount that the Magic would let happen. So I think that TJ Warren, although he definitely deserved his success as he's very underrated and he had some very good games, I think that he won't be able to maintain this and he'll probably peter out to around like 20 points per game like he normally did.
That's a very interesting take. Mine is that there will be at least one surprise team in the conference finals in the Eastern Conference. I mean, there have been so many teams who have been played exceedingly well in the Eastern Conference. In fact, in the bubble, I think the Eastern Conference has an extremely good record against the Western Conference. I think they've won almost twice as many games against the Western Conference as the West has in the East. But I think that one of the Bucks or Raptors will not make it to the conference finals. Now, the most likely scenario of that happening would be in the conference semifinals for the Raptors losing to either the Celtics or the 76ers, and one of those teams moving on to the conference finals. But I can also see a scenario where the Miami Heat, who have beaten the Bucks both times they faced them this season and are actually facing them tomorrow, they could actually pull out a huge win for the huge upset for the Miami Heat, and they could make it to the conference finals. And even the Indiana Pacers, they've been playing exceedingly well. They've beaten like 3 they won 3 games in a row so far, and they could easily win a couple more, putting them in the 5 seed and putting them in a spot to possibly topple one of the great dynasties of the East.
Yeah, I don't think that I don't know about the Pacers' ability to really make a conference finals push because the games that they've played have been fairly easy opponents. Whereas you look at the rest of the schedule, and they have the Suns, which is like not too difficult, but then they have the Lakers, the Heat, the Rockets, and then the Heat again back to back. I don't know whether they'll be able to win against those more difficult opponents. So I'm not sure if in the playoff format they'll be as strong as they have been so far in the bubble. Um, with the Celtics, again, there's also kind of the problem of just their performance recently. We've seen some disappointing performances from Jason Tatum, or one specifically, and Kemba Walker getting limited minutes. And the Celtics really haven't looked like they are a team that's ready to compete with the Bucks or the Raptors. And the same goes for the Sixers, who've been quite disappointing. So I think if any team is going to make an upset, I think it would be the Heat. And it'll be very interesting to see whether they can take uh, the Bucks or the Raptors down and make it to the conference finals. But my hot take, however, is about the Western Conference, and it's about kind of the situation that's going on with the eighth or the ninth seed. So I took a look at kind of all the teams that are kind of fighting for the eighth seed right now. So you have the Grizzlies, the Blazers, the Spurs, the Pelicans, the Suns, and the Kings. And what I think is going to happen, even though before the bubble began, I made a prediction that the Grizzlies would keep the eighth seed but lose the play-in tournament. I actually looked at their schedule, and it's actually very difficult. I think they're actually going to win no games during the remainder of the bubble. And they're going to drop out of the eighth seed and the ninth seed altogether. And they're not even going to play in the play-in tournament. I think that the Blazers will win a few of their games, and even though the Spurs have looked like the better team so far, I think the Pelicans will take the ninth seed spot because they have such an easy schedule for the rest of the bubble. So I think that the play-in tournament will be between the Blazers and the Pelicans, actually, which is not what we really expected before the bubble. And I think that the Blazers would probably win just from having to only win one game. I think they'll be able to use that advantage and make it to the playoffs.
Well, I actually partially agree with you here. I do agree with you in the sense that the Grizzlies are definitely going to be losing a lot of their games, but I think that they'll probably have the ninth seed, not necessarily like 10th or even lower seed, and that's because if you look at the Grizzlies schedule, their schedule is very difficult. But then again, the Blazers, the Spurs, and some of the other teams also have very difficult schedules. So I think that because the Grizzlies have like a 1.5 game lead about, I think that they'll be able to hold on and they have a little bit more of a leeway. And the Grizzlies did lose Jaren Jackson Jr., which was a pretty big hit. But as we speak, the Grizzlies are playing the Jazz right now, and they're actually playing a very, very close game. So I think that the Grizzlies, they do have the capability to like take these good teams to very close games, but it's still very tough, very, very tough opponents. So it'll be interesting to see. But I think that they'll probably have the ninth seed. Maybe like the Blazers or Spurs will probably take the eighth seed just because of how well they've been playing recently.
Yeah, my confidence is not that much there with the Spurs, although I really like how they're playing. It's way too young of a team and too inexperienced and too little talent ultimately on that team. Like you need to have like Rudy Gay or Jakob Pertl have insane games, and you have to have at least one of Lonnie Walker, Derek White, or DeJounte Murray score like 20 points in order for them to get a win against a decent team. And looking at their schedule, I don't think that's possible. Now, going back to the Grizzlies are actually in a current 5-point game. They're down 5 to the Utah Jazz right now, and there's 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Anything can happen, but say the Grizzlies lose this game, now they would only have a 1-game lead over the Portland Trailblazers, and the next games for the Grizzlies are against the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Toronto Raptors, the Boston Celtics, and the Milwaukee Bucks. It's going to be a really tough road. The only game I could see them realistically winning, if not for today's game, is against the Bucks on the last day because the Bucks will be resting their starters. So I ultimately agree that the Blazers will definitely take the 8th seed. But whether or not the Pelicans will beat the Grizzlies for the 9th seed remains to be seen, because the Pelicans are super unstable as a team.
All right, so that wraps it up for episode 4 now of the Triple Dub podcast, the first in season 1 at that. And let us know whether you agree with our both our power rankings changes and our team of the week. We look forward to doing it all again next week, and hopefully we have some interesting things to talk about happen during the next week for next episode. But if you liked this video, then leave a like, and if you didn't, let us know why in the comments section so we can change that in the future. These are the Benchwarmers signing off. See ya.